The REST API acronym stands for Representational State Transfer Application Programming Interface. An application programming interface, or API, is a set of clearly defined methods of communication between various software components. The REST API is a stateless, client-server architecture designed for efficient exchange of data between networked applications that often uses the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. The Hypertext Transfer Protocol is the protocol of the Internet. REST is used by both websites and mobile apps, and it typically exposes services over the Internet. The REST API has a low overhead, efficient data exchange using JavaScript object notation. It is simpler than SOAP, or the Simple Object Access Protocol, and is compatible with most modern programming languages. The CRUD acronym stands for Create, Read, Update and Delete. It refers to data operations. For these CRUD operations, use the HTTP POST, GET, PUT and DELETE methods, respectively. This tutorial will CRUD customers. The Universal Resource Identifier where the REST API services can be accessed by the client typically begin with API, these are known as the endpoints. Here are this tutorial's endpoints. To read all the customers, access the API customers endpoint with a GetRequest method. The response will be a JSON array of customer objects. To read just one customer, access the API customers endpoint with the identifier of the customer appended to it. The response will be a JSON object. To create one customer, access the API customers endpoint with a POST method and set the body of the request to the JSON object of the customer. The identifier of the new customer will be returned as a JSON response. To update one customer, access the API customers endpoint with a PUT method and set the body of the request to the JSON object of the changed customer data. The identifier of the customer to update must be appended to the request endpoint. To delete one customer, access the API customers endpoint with the identifier of the customer record appended to it. Install Node.js and, if using Windows, set the path environment variable to include the path to the Node.exe. Create server.js file. This is boilerplate Node.js HTTP server code. The FS module is used for opening and reading HTML files to send to the client. The HTTP module is used to create the HTTP server, which will be set to listen on port 8000. This is boilerplate code for working with an array. In this case, CRUD operations on the customer's array. These functions will be used by the endpoints. This example does not use a database. To simplify it, an array is used to hold the customers. Have a good look at these functions. When a customer is deleted, its place in the array is set to null. This is done to ensure data integrity since the index into the array is also the identifier of the customer. Here is the HTTP server code that handles requests from the client. The GET requests will return customer data as well as HTML files. The POST requests will create customers, while the PUT requests will update customers. Finally, delete requests delete customers from the customer's array. Notice the last few lines of code that return a HTTP status of 405, meaning that all other methods are not allowed. First, write the code that reads customer data and reads HTML files from the server. Make the URL lowercase so as to avoid case sensitivity. Default to index.html. If the request begins with API, then the client is trying to access an endpoint. Split the URL path into an array to make it easier to handle. This stands for, is not a number. Return JSON to the client. This endpoint returns all the customers in the customers array. Return JSON to the client. Return a 404 path not found error to the client. UTF-8 needs to be in quotes because it should be a string. This will be corrected shortly. Now, run the server code. Point the browser to 127.0.0.1:8000/ the name of the HTML file to download. Notice in the debug console, the server logs all the requests made by the client. Now, write the endpoint that creates customers. The post request will include a body of text which will be in the format of JavaScript object notation. Make sure the parse statement is in a try block because if data other than JSON is submitted then the server will crash. Return JSON to the client. Write the endpoint that updates customers. Return JSON to the client. The first parameter of the update customer function is the customer ID. Finally, write the endpoint that deletes customers. Return JSON to the client. The parameter of the delete customer function is the customer ID. This CSS shows and hides the modal edit customer screen. You will see the HTML code of this screen in just a moment. This is typical Ajax code. Ajax allows for a way to display dynamic content without having to refresh the whole HTML page. This is the Ajax function that makes it possible to create, read, update and delete data using the endpoints. Notice that this is not code written with an emphasis on compatibility. Some fat has been trimmed to make the code more succinct. As you can see, the type of content submitted in the body of the request is JavaScript object notation code. This is the customer ID edit variable used to store the ID of the customer being edited. This variable will be referenced shortly. This is the add customer to HTML document function which creates and adds HTML elements to the document object model. The edit links on click event needs to be written. All it does is download a customer from the appropriate endpoint and then shows the modal edit form with the customer information. The delete links on click event needs to be written. It triggers the appropriate endpoint to delete a customer from the customer array on the server. The submit create form function will submit post requests to the appropriate endpoint. The submit update form function will submit put requests to the appropriate endpoint. The read customers function will delete the customers from the document object model, download the customers from the appropriate endpoint, and then reinsert them into the document. This updates the HTML document with the customers should the user refresh the page. This is the create customer HTML form. This form calls the submit create form function when it is submitted. This is where customers are added to the document object model. This is the modal update or edit customer HTML form. This form calls the submit_update_form function when it is submitted. It has the ID of update form which will be referenced in the code shortly. Begin writing the client-side code. A404 error was returned because the endpoint path was not correct. Now we know the server-side code is throwing errors properly. Like this video and subscribe to see more like it.